Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try and do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. Why is the success rate of big projects, and I'm talking about mega projects around the world, abysmal? More often than not, these projects have lengthy delays, they go way over budget, and sometimes they don't even get completed. The list is long. NASA's James Webb Space Telescope, the Three Gorges Dam in central China, the Monju nuclear plant in Japan, the Brandenburg Airport in Berlin, and oh yes, the Olympics. And not just one, two, or three Olympic Games, but every single one that's been held since 1960 have all gone over budget. Why? You may have your own theories, but there is research on why mega projects fail or succeed. It's compiled and explained in a new book called How Big Things Get Done by Professor Bent Flyvbjerg of Oxford University and IT University of Copenhagen and Canadian journalist Dan Gardner. And Dan joins me. Hello, Dan, and welcome.
Hi, Mary. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, this is great. How did you come to write this book with Bent, who's considered a world expert on mega projects?
Right. And of course, I should emphasize, I do not build large things. I've never built a hydroelectric dam. I have no particular background in giant projects. However, the reason why I connected with Bent is that a really core piece of the puzzle is how people think. And that happens to be my specialty. I study psychology and human decision making. And the really curious thing is that when you look at the data that Bent has compiled, and Bent has the world's largest database of projects, you find this amazing and dismal pattern of failure in all sorts of different project types, completely different project types, information technology, bridges, hydroelectric dams, every type of project you can imagine, projects that seem completely different, and yet you have this same pattern of failure. And you find it in country after country after country. One of the interesting things about doing the interviews for this book has been whenever I do an interview with anybody anywhere, they'll always say, but we're particularly bad, aren't we? And I have to say, no, I'm going to burst your bubble. No, you're bad, but we're all bad.
Okay, first of all, why would anyone even want that reputation of being particularly bad? That's not good.
I don't know, but people are really wedded to this idea that somehow that we're uniquely bad. We've got particular problems with this. And if you look at Bent's data, he actually doesn't find a huge amount of geographical variation because we're all equally bad. So it's not a good story.
Well, you know what? Sorry, let me just interrupt. I should say, too, that I was impressed with the numbers, like how he's been tracking this, because I understand that right now he's at about 16,000 mega projects. It represents over 130 countries. I mean, he's amassed a fair amount of info.
That's right. This is like decades. It's taken decades to develop this database. And one of the issues that, it was 30 years ago, Bent started to do this research. And one of his first findings was well, how good are we at delivering on these big things that are so important? That's a really basic question. And the answer was they couldn't find an answer. There was no answer. People had not compiled the data. And that's what Bent has been doing now for 30 years. And this is what the database tells us. The database tells us that we are really, really bad at big projects. And when I say bad, I want to emphasize there are three basic ways to measure a project, because these things are, these are the basic promises of a project. The project is going to cost a certain amount of money. The project is going to take a certain amount of time, and it's going to deliver certain benefits. So if it's a train, it will be things like passengers moved, or if it's a product, it will be number of units sold or a certain amount of profit or whatever. So those are the three headings: cost, time, benefit. Well, how many projects deliver just on cost and time, right? They're on budget and on time. 8.5%. How many projects deliver on cost and time, and most importantly, benefit, i.e., they deliver on all three of their basic promises, 0.5%, which, if you want to put it the other way, is 99.5% of big projects do not deliver on all three of their core promises. So that's a really, really awful record. And in fact, that actually understates it, because then the question becomes, well, how badly do they blow the budget? How over schedule do they come in? How badly do they come in under benefits? And what Bent has shown is that in project type after project type, not all, and I think we can get to that later, but in project type after project type, most project types, what you have in the distribution curve, as statisticians like to say, it's not a normal bell curve. Because if it was a normal bell curve, you wouldn't have really extreme results, right? You think about human height. That's how we're distributed. It's a normal bell curve. So you don't have people who are 37 feet tall. However, what Bent has shown is that in project type after project type, the distribution has fat tails, which is to say that tail on the end, it just goes way out there and keeps continuing way out, so that you get really, really, really extreme results. So that these projects are not at risk of just going 20% over, 30% over. They're at risk of going 200% over, 300%, 500%, 1,000%. There is no upper limit. So it's the equivalent of, as I say, if human height were distributed according to a fat tail, with fat tails, you would have some people, they would be rare, but you would have some people who would be 37 feet tall, or considerably taller. You know, it could be 100 feet tall, whatever.
So can I assume, so can I assume then that these fat tails, because they're so extreme and they can go on, that represents extreme amounts of going over budget, extreme delays,
really horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible stuff.
If you're in the fat tail, be in the fat tail and your results is a disaster, and that's where you don't want to be. And so, you know, look, for instance, we talk a lot in the book about the Sydney Opera House. And the Sydney Opera House is one of the most famous buildings in the world, and you might think that's a great triumph. Well, no, not so much. The Sydney Opera House, if I remember the figure, it went 1,600% over budget, 1,600% over budget, which is almost incomprehensible, right? That's the kind of extremes that we're talking about here. And, you know, when you're talking about a project which is big and ambitious and expensive anyway, and it goes 1,600% over budget, that's the kind of result that can destroy careers, sink organizations, destroy companies, you know, overturn governments. In fact, one of the interesting aspects, just parenthetically, about the Sydney Opera House story is that if you ask people, well, Sydney Opera House is one of the world's most famous buildings.
Yeah.
Who was the architect who designed it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody knows this man's name. His name was Jorn Utzon. And the reason nobody knows his name is because that project got into such terrible trouble that he was actually fired midway through the project. And it destroyed his career. His reputation was ruined. He never got major commissions after that. And so the genius, the visionary who imagined these wonderful buildings, it ruined his career. And so it robbed the world of all the buildings he would have produced anyway. So what we need to understand is this isn't just of interest for bean counters, right? This isn't just a matter of accounting. If you end up in the fat tails, you can really seriously destroy, as I say, organizations, careers, anything you can imagine. So people need to understand that when you undertake these big projects, and by the way, I'm going to speak to another point about mega projects. This isn't just about mega projects, but what people need to understand that when you undertake one of these complex, ambitious projects, what's at risk is not 20% over budget. It's if you get into one of these scenarios where it's gone completely wrong, everything is at risk. The risk is huge. The risk can't be overstated.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have to take these so very seriously.
Yeah. And I want to explore a few other examples about that. But okay, am I wrong though in thinking that we've heard of so many And as you know, the evidence points out, the majority of these mega projects, something will go wrong with them, right? Whether it's the budget, the delay, or even what was expected, the vision. I think the public at this point, we expect it now, don't we? I mean, for something to come in on time, on budget, and it's what we wanted, that seems so rare that people don't even expect that anymore.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I think that's a level of cynicism which becomes a barrier to attempting big projects, right? So if somebody comes along and says, I have a fantastic idea, it's going to cost X dollars, and you say, well, that you're right, that does sound like a fantastic idea, but I don't believe your budget. It's going to cost so much more. Forget it, we're not doing it. Well, at that point, guess what? You've just thrown out a great idea. A great idea, you know, and when we're talking about big projects, we're talking about great human ambitions, right? These are the visions that really can change our world and make things better. And so if we are cynically tossing these things aside because no, can't afford it, no, we're not going to talk about this, we're losing something. So what we really have to do is get serious about this and get better at producing forecasts. You know, how much is this going to cost really? How much is this? How long is it going to take? And what benefits is it going to deliver? We can do this, right? We know this for a fact. There are, remember, as few as there are, you know, 0.5%.
Yes.
There are successful projects where they nailed the budget, they nailed the schedule, they nailed the benefits. And so what we need to do is we need to learn from the successes as well as the failures.
Absolutely. Okay. So I want to get into that. I want to get into these, you know, the pattern that Bent has discovered in these, you know, projects that succeeded. One of the things that he talks about a lot in the book, both of you do, is this whole concept of thinking slow, but acting fast. Think slow, act fast. Okay. Explain that to me.
So first, let me say something, acknowledge something. Think slow, act fast is not new, cool, counterintuitive advice, right? Make haste slowly was actually the personal slogan of a Roman emperor. So this is old advice, been around for a long time. We fully acknowledge this. The key is to understand that people don't do that.
Yeah.
And so what we see in failed projects, which is the vast majority, what we see is people very quickly get to, you know, delivering the project. You know, you want shovels in the ground, right? We want to get going. And we do that for a whole host of reasons. And the project starts early and there's progress being made and everyone's excited because the project is moving along quickly because that's what everyone wants. Yay, we're going to succeed. Well, guess what? If you do that, you haven't engaged in slow, careful, rigorous planning, the sort of planning that surfaces problems and creates solutions during planning. Well, if you ignore problems or you don't discover problems, they don't disappear, right? So if you start delivery, you get shovels in the ground and you're doing the work, the problem's going to surface sooner or later. The problem that you did not discover and did not solve during planning. And when it surfaces, then you're going to be running around during delivery, which is when things get really expensive because you've got shovels in the ground. You're going to be running around trying to find solutions. And then they're going to bump into other problems, right? And so, because there will be other problems, there are always other problems. And what you end up having is chain collisions of problems. They're bumping into each other. These problems, these delays start to aggregate. And in their aggregate, they become worse. The project starts to bog down. You get into the cycle of people are just running around trying to stamp out brush fires while trying to deal with the public, while speaking to the media, while trying to assure their financiers.
Yeah.
And around it goes. And so what happens is you get into the cycle where things slow down and slow down and slow down. And so what happens in this process, which is the normal way people proceed, which is they think fast and then they end up acting slow. So the project starts with a rush of excitement and everyone's happy, and then everything bogs down. You blow your schedule, your budget gets blown up, it all goes to heck.
Right. Let me bring up 2 points there quickly. The one is there's no way you can plan for everything. right? And legitimately, right? Things will
Absolutely.
happen. People go on strike. There's inflation. Costs will rise. Oh my goodness, there's a
Pandemics.
pandemic. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Right. You cannot factor everything in. And so
No,
what about that? That's legitimate. That's going to slow things down.
absolutely. Absolutely. So all of this, everything about your project, you should think of it in terms of probabilities, right? This is not on off. This is not, it's well planned or it's not. This is about probabilities. See, what you want to do is you just want to incrementally, with this little improvement, increase the probability of success, increase the probability of success. So, what are you doing with problems? With problems in planning and discovering problems and discovering solutions in planning. Every problem discovered in planning is a problem and solved is a problem that won't arise during delivery. Is that going to eliminate all problems? Is that going to eliminate all surprises? Absolutely not. But because of course, inevitably there will be things, right? There's
Yeah,
always things.
for sure.
So stuff is going to happen. But the fewer problems there are emerging, the fewer problems there are to collide and start that chain reaction of collisions, right? So if you have a very well planned project and then something arises, something bolt out of the blue, you'll be in a better position because you're not dealing with 6 different problems simultaneously. You're dealing with one problem.
Yeah. Can I bring up there? I can tell that you love Pixar because Pixar kept coming up
Yeah.
again and again, right? As a company that plans really meticulously. And
Yeah.
then of course, look at their track rate of success for their movies.
Yeah. That's right. And Pixar is a wonderful example for something that's very, very important. When we talk about planning, very often people, particularly in Silicon Valley, I mean, planning is not a word that they love in Silicon Valley. People roll their eyes when you hear planning because what do you think of when you imagine planning? You imagine not doing, right? You want to get to doing. And you imagine that planning is like a bureaucratic exercise. That's when you're filling out flow charts and schedules and budgets and all that stuff, which is true. I mean, that is part of planning. But that's not really the heart of planning as we talk about it in the book. And what Pixar does is just genius, is perfect illustration. You might say, how does Pixar produce its movies, right? And they have this amazing track record. Unlike every Hollywood studio, they have an amazing track record of having one success after another success after another success. That's crazy. So you might say, how do they do this? Well, they must be artistic geniuses, right? It's somebody must wake up one morning and go, I have a vision, and Finding Nemo comes out, right? Or whatever. They must have all these amazing creative people. Well, they do have amazing creative people, but they do not wake up one morning with Finding Nemo in their heads. What Pixar does is they go to their directors and they say, look, big emphasis on planning before we get to the production. And remember, production's where it's expensive. That's where all the money goes, right? You got to bring in the Hollywood stars to do the voiceovers. You got to get the big expensive computers involved, the graphic artists. Whereas planning over here, that's pretty cheap, right? You're just sketching and so on. So we like planning because it's cheap. So what do? They say to the director, okay, develop your idea. Okay, so you work on your idea a little bit, and then you develop a treatment, a few pages, and you share that with other people, and you get some feedback on that, and you develop that, and you go back and forth a few times. Then you start on what? A script. Well, you go and you write a script, and then you go and share that with some people, and you get some feedback. So far, everything I've described is what every Hollywood studio does, right? This is all standard. But then Pixar does something different. Once you then have a script that you feel, kind of good about, you sit down with artists. And the artists draw a picture. And this picture represents basically 2 seconds of screen time, if you can imagine. And then here's another picture, rough sketch of another 2 seconds of screen time. And so if you do this over and over again for thousands of pictures, you get one movie. So you've now got these still photos for, the entire script. Well, what do you do then? They take a photograph of one sketch, photograph of the next one, photograph of the next one, and they stitch those together into a video. And by the way, is this high tech? No, this is something a 12-year-old can do on an iPhone. Okay, it's amazing to me. By the way, we interviewed Pete Docter, the 3-time Oscar award-winning director at Pixar, and he was sort of like, I don't know why other people don't do this, but they don't.
Because it takes time. It takes time.
It does. Absolutely right. It takes time and an enormous amount of work
Yeah.
at a time when you want to say, let's get going, right?
No,
So,
but you know
then they've
what
got,
though? But Dan, to your point though, if they didn't do it and then they went into production, having a delay in planning is one thing. Having a delay in production with all the people involved, the locations,
that's it.
the animation, that costs a lot more money than a delay in planning.
Right. So let me give you a specific example of Pete Docter himself. One of my favorite movies, Inside Out. Pete Docter was the director of Inside Out. It's about a little girl, and it's inside her head, so it's literally
Yeah.
in her brain. Early on in the script, in this process, they had names for all the emotions. Like the characters represented emotions, but they had names, but actual names like Bob and Frank and Nancy, and right. And they had a much wider array of emotions represented. I can't remember, they had like 11 or 12 or 13 different characters, right? And so then they go through and they do this very rough video. And they take this very rough video and they show it to an audience of Pixar employees. And the feedback comes. And the feedback says, I was confused. Which character is what now? Right? Because the names and the emotions were separate. And so people were getting confused. Bob represents what emotion? Well, I'm supposed to figure that out just based on the way he appears or the way he acts, right? It got confusing. And so they were like, oh, okay, that's wrong. You know what we're going to do? In the next iteration, they took out all the human names and they replaced the names with the actual emotion. So it's like joy, it's sadness, it's anger.
Right. Yeah.
And so and they also reduced the number of characters. So that was the next iteration in which they rewrote the script, in which they redrew all those drawings and they stitched them all together into another movie. Now, what I've just described is a lot of work, but because you're doing it now in rough form, it's not all that expensive. But what I've just described, if they had done that during production, you're talking about millions and millions and millions of dollars. You cannot afford to be fixing that problem during production.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they do that, they fix that problem, and then they do another iteration, another rough movie, and another iteration, and another iteration, and another iteration. And each time they're getting feedback, finding problems, fixing problems. And so gradually the movie starts to emerge and take form. And they do this as much as 8 or 9 times before they finally say, okay, this is our script. This is our plan. Let's put it into production. And that's where the genius comes from, because they have looked at everything. They've tried an infinite number of ideas. They've looked at every possible problem. It's amazing, that process.
Okay. But, so another point I wanted to bring up is I'm sure there are people listening to this and maybe they've created their own startups. They're in the tech field, whatever. And they say, okay, you know what? If I waited around and planned as long as you seem to be promoting, I would never have gotten my startup up and going. The whole point is, you got to get moving, work out the kinks and the problems as you go along, or you will never launch. There's that thinking that's very popular and attractive today. And we do have success stories. So what's the evidence behind that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is the mantra in Silicon Valley, right? It's get it out there, see what happens, change your product, get going again. We actually completely agree. Again, it goes back to this definition of planning, right? If you think of planning as sitting in a room cut off from the world, engaged in a bureaucratic exercise, you're right. You can sit and do that forever and you will never produce a final product and you're ready to go and off you go. But if you think of planning as an iterative experiential process, well, that's totally different. Remember, the key word there is experiential. Experience. Human beings are great experiential learners. In other words, try something, see what happens, draw a lesson from it, try something else. We're really, really good at that. We're really bad at just looking ahead in the abstract and saying, I'll figure out a plan, and then coming up with a plan that works perfectly the first time. We don't do that. So what you want to create is a situation where you're able to try something, learn, iterate, try again, right? So with Pixar, Pixar is doing that with its drawings. They're in that iterative loop. Frank Gehry, who we talk about a great deal, the legendary Canadian-American architect, Frank Gehry does that with computer simulations, both with physical models and computer simulations. He has these amazingly detailed computer simulations, which allow him to, well, here's an idea. Let's see, what happens if I try this? And then he looks at the simulation and says, okay, that doesn't work, throw it out, etc. Iterate, iterate, iterate. So if you're a software developer, think about that Silicon Valley model. I think I have a good piece of software here, but can you find all the bugs in software before you ship it? Can you make it absolutely perfect before you ship it? No. What you need to do is you need to get it out to real people in the real world, hopefully, if that's possible. And we can talk about when it is and isn't, and get them to use it so that you have some experience that you can look at and say, okay, that didn't work. This does work. Okay, then we're going to iterate. And so if you look at what Silicon Valley is doing, it's the same sort of experiential, iterative process. It's just in a different way. Now, the key thing is to understand the distinction between when is it possible to take your project and iterate in the real world, and when is it not possible, right? So with Frank Gehry, can he just build a building, have a look at it and say, that doesn't work, knock it down and do it again? No, you can't do that. So that's why you have to go to a computer simulation, because real world iteration doesn't work. If you are a software designer producing, say, a video game, can you afford to ship a video game that has some bugs and then hear from your users about that and then iterate? Yes, and they do that all the time. Why can you afford to do that? You can afford to do that because it's a video game. Nobody's going to die if, in fact, there is a bug in there that you haven't detected. So you can iterate that way. But even then, of course, there's a limit. If you ship a product that's too buggy, that's a total mess, you could damage your company's reputation, you could anger your customer base, and so on.
Yeah.
So that's why
you have focus groups as well, right? You have small groups rather than putting it out en masse. Yeah. You know what? So, can I just talk about, because you raised Frank Gehry, what I really loved about his story is that, well, there's so many points that he raises, but sometimes you just have to walk away, right, from a project.
Yeah.
I mean, it may look attractive on the surface, but once you do an analysis, sometimes you do need to walk away. And what I like about the Frank Gehry story and the Bilbao Museum is that originally they came to him and they wanted him to renovate an existing building, right? And turn it into this spectacular tourist attraction. Because they said to Frank, we want to be, the new tourist place in Spain. We want people to flock here. And Frank, after looking at it, he said, this isn't going to work. This is not,
right.
You need a whole separate location. I see you've got this, land at the waterfront. You need to do this building from scratch in a totally different location to achieve what you want. And I really love that angle of the story.
That's exactly. Frank Gehry, and I mean, Frank Gehry learned this like most people. I was just talking about experiential learning. Frank Gehry learned this the hard way, the school of hard knocks. You have to identify what you think is necessary for success on the project. And if you cannot obtain those conditions, walk away. They originally, as you say, when they originally came to him, they said to him, we want to renovate this lovely old building in Bilbao. And Bilbao, by the way, is in northern Spain, and it's an important part of the story. If you ask yourself, think about the average architect, the average person dealing with this project. And a client comes to you and says, we want you to take on this project. And it's very straightforward. It's basically renovate this old building to turn it into an art gallery. That's a simple yes or no. You can either accept this commission or you can decline, and that's it. Walk away, right? Or whatever. But Frank Gehry actually starts with, and this is a point that I think is absolutely fundamental and routinely overlooked in project planning. Frank Gehry actually starts with questions. Rather than giving them an answer, I'll take that, or no, I won't. He simply says, basically, why are you doing this project? Which sounds, again, it's one of those sort of pieces of advice where you kind of go, doesn't everybody do this? No, I assure you, people don't do this. So Frank Gehry, and he really tries to understand and engage with the client to try and figure out what exactly are you trying to achieve? And that's not on a surface level. right? You can ask people, what do you want to achieve with this project? And you'll get a quick, glib answer. But very often there are deeper motivations, and he really engages with that person to try and understand the deeper motivations and the goal. And in the
Mm-hmm.
case of Bilbao, he was dealing with regional officials who said to him, it was very straightforward. They said, look, we're a poor backwater in Spain. We're a former industrial area. Spain has this enormous tourism industry, but they all go to Madrid and southern Spain. They don't come to the north. In fact, most people had never heard of Bilbao outside of Spain. And so they said, we want something that's going to attract the world's tourists up from southern Spain to Bilbao. And Frank Gehry then, without information, he goes and looks at the building. He says, this isn't going to do it, right? The building
Yeah.
is nice. He actually likes the building, but it's not going to do it. It's not really suitable for an art gallery. But more importantly, when was the last time you heard about a renovation becoming a global phenomenon? Everyone learns about the renovation and they say, I have to go and see that renovation, right? No, yet that hasn't happened. But you do rarely hear about cases in which you have, an amazing new piece of architecture that captures the world's attention and that draws tourists. And so that's when Gehry says, look, if your goal is you want to attract tourists up here in such significant numbers that you're going to change the economic course of this region,
Yeah.
you need a new building. And oh, by the way, Frank Gehry, can tell you, you see that piece of land down there? That's where we need to do this. We need to do, and that's the origins of the Bilbao Guggenheim, which then becomes one of the most successful, arguably, it's one of the most successful projects in history. We talked about on time, on budget. Benefits, it was supposed to draw in a certain number of tourists. It blew way past that benchmark. It basically exceeded the client's wildest dreams. So basically it was the perfect project. It did everything it was supposed to do and then some.
Yeah.
And it all started because Frank Gehry started with that basic question. Why are we doing this? What's
Yeah.
the goal?
Do,
What's the
do you
goal?
know? Yeah, I'm really glad you did bring that up, Dan, because for me, that's a life lesson. That's not just a
Yeah.
lesson in mega projects, right? Because why? Like you can apply that to so many things. So if that becomes your goal, your focus, that's fundamental. That's journalism, right? That's all
Yeah.
kinds of jobs.
It's everything.
It's everything. It's like, what is our life about? This is why. This is what we're working towards. So
That's
yeah.
right.
And you never lose sight of that.
In the book, we talk about, in fact, we illustrate it with a kitchen renovation that goes horribly wrong. And by the way, I wanted to emphasize that point.
Oh yeah, that's right. This is not just mega projects. I was really interested in seeing that he follows his couple that does a reno in their home.
You remember at the outset, I talked about how this is human decision making. What really matters is human decision making, right? It's not technology and money and all the rest of it. It's human decision making. And so there's this home renovation, and they started with a kitchen. Literally, it's a couple in Brooklyn, David and Deborah, and they started with a kitchen. They said, we're going to do a kitchen renovation, and they did it in a way that I think anybody would say, yeah, this is right. They're proceeding in the right fashion. They hired an architect. The architect does a detailed drawings. It sounds perfect, and then basically the project starts, and then it metastasizes. And before you know it, they've spent this $170,000 kitchen renovation has turned into a $1 million gutting of their entire townhouse. And they've done it in the most inefficient way possible because it's all sort of haphazard. It's all unplanned. They just keep expanding and expanding in an unplanned way, which means it's the most inefficient way of going ahead and doing this. So how did that happen? And the answer is, it's this really simple question. Why are you doing this? They never had that conversation, right? Why are we doing this? Well, and if you had asked them, the quick and glib answer, because everyone has a quick and glib answer, would be, well, it's to have a nice kitchen. I want a nice kitchen. What else is there to talk about? No, don't do that. If you instead do what Frank Gehry does, you start to say, well, no, really, what's the motivation? So you want a nice kitchen. What do you do in your kitchen? Do you cook for other people? Do you have guests over, or is it just you and your spouse, or etc.? And then you start to have a real serious discussion that explores the wants and needs of the client or yourself, depending upon who's doing the project. And you start to get a real flavor for, well, what is the real motivation for this project? What's the real goal? And once you have a real deeper understanding of the goal, guess what? Your understanding of, well, what's the best way to achieve the goal is likely to change.
Yeah, it strikes me that you've got to be part psychologist in this as well, to really make a successful project. Okay, you know what? I want to get through a couple of other sort of key themes in the book. One of them, which I'd never heard of, and I thought, okay, that really makes sense, is a phrase, reference class forecasting. And I thought, yeah, that is so true. How we think that whatever we're doing is unique. Right? That everything is specific to whatever this project is, but it's not. So can you talk about that and how important that is?
Right. So first thing to understand is that there's something in psychology called the planning fallacy, which is basically when we try and estimate how long will a task take, we're always wrong. We're just always wrong. And we're always wrong in the same direction. We always underestimate. We always underestimate the task. And the funny thing is that even if you know about that fallacy and you're aware that psychologically you're subject to it, you're still going to commit it.
Is it called optimistic, though? You're optimistic.
Yeah, and you always err on the side of optimism. And it happens for a number of reasons. But specifically, how do you correct for this and other forecasting errors? But that is the principal one. How do you correct for these things? Well, the problem is that when you look at a project and you think about, well, here's my unique little project, and I know the factors that are involved, and I know the steps that I have to do, I can just total these things up, and there's my summary. The problem is that the world is just too complex for that, right? Because in your nice little summary of what's going to happen, you don't have all the shocks and surprises and the delays that other people will have. You don't have COVID popping up, right? There's an infinite number of things can pop up to mess up your plan. And that's what you've effectively done. Right. You're trying to basically create a budget and a schedule based on a plan.
Yeah. Okay. So base this on an example. Give me an example where reference class forecasting should come in or would come in.
Oh, well, dead simple one, since we were talking about kitchen renovations. How everybody does a kitchen renovation and estimates the cost. They go, oh, I want cabinets, and I see in the catalog they cost this much, and I want a new stove, and it costs this much, and I want granite countertops, and it costs this much. And then you just add those things up, and that's how much it's going to cost, right? And then schedule. If you get the person who's going to do the work, and you say, how long will it take to do this? Oh, it's that, and that. You just add those things up, and that's your estimate. That's how everybody does an estimate. I guarantee you that estimate's going to be wrong. It's going to be wrong for that simple reason that the world is complex and little crazy things are going to happen. They're going to mess it up. So then how do you do a better forecast? Well, the problem is that there's just no way to figure out what crazy little things are going to happen. If you knew that, then you could just do it that way. But you can't figure out those things in advance. So what do? Think of your project not as being a unique, special little creature. Think of your project as being one of those. Think of it as being part of a larger class of projects. So in this case, it's a kitchen renovation. Well, in that case, let's go to other completed projects, not estimates, actual real world kitchen projects that were completed. How much did they cost? And here's one, here's another. And you average out the cost on that class. That's how much your kitchen renovation is going to cost. How long did those kitchen renovations take? That's how long your kitchen renovation is going to take. Why? Why does this method work so much better? Because it's ignoring all the specifics of your special little project. So you would say, how could that work? Because my project's special. It's different than all these others. And the answer is, in all of these results, and remember, they're real world results, they were all influenced by real world surprises. Like, how often does some weird little thing pop up and cause some 3-week delay? You don't know, but buried in all that data, it's there.
Right.
That question is in that data.
Okay, but
if you use that,
sorry, yeah. So let me just shift it over a little bit, though. There must be millions of kitchen renos out there, right? But then there are projects that, okay, maybe they're not unique, but they're rare. And so I think about the examples you have, like the Olympics. Sure, we've had lots of Olympics, but they don't happen that often and they're a big deal.
Yeah.
So they're kind of rare. But as I mentioned in the introduction, they have failed, as successful projects. Like I think the Montreal Olympics it was over 700% or something, its budget. What's going on with you? I mean, how can the Olympics be fixed so that it becomes successful?
Oh, it's super simple. The Olympics should stop moving around. The Olympics should be held in one place every 4 years, and it should be held in that same place the next 4 years, and so on. And then you wouldn't have this problem. The Olympics is basically, if you took all the mistakes that people make in producing projects and you condense them into one project class, that's the Olympics. So for example, here's a real simple one. One of the things we emphasize in the book is the importance of experience. Well, because the Olympics is moving from this city to another city to another city, nobody has experience doing the Olympics, right? The people who did the London 2012 Olympics did not do I think it was Brazil 2016. The people who did Brazil 2016 did not do the next Olympics, etc.
Right.
So what happens is over and over again, you get neophytes. You get people who haven't ever done this before tackling a giant project. When you have people who don't have experience tackling a giant project, you're in trouble. And so it's Bent calls it the eternal beginners syndrome. The people delivering the Olympics are eternal beginners. So that's number one problem. Number two, the Olympics, people always try and use it for prestige, right? We're going to show off how big and spectacular and dramatic our city is. We're all going to look very cool doing this. And so what do? That means you have to have super cool architecture, unlike anything that's ever been done before. Again, guess what? If it's never been done before, you have no experience with it. You are maximizing the odds of it going over budget and over time. Mm-hmm. So if you just go down the list of all the ways in which you can increase the risk of a project going haywire, the Olympics ticks all the boxes.
Okay, there's one other factor I want to bring up because I think it's something maybe people either they don't recognize or they haven't thought of, and that is the idea of modularity. Can you talk about why that's important? And I did like the example about nuclear reactors. Using modularity for that, and that is now becoming perhaps more of a way of thinking.
So, as I just said about the Olympics, if you think about all that, it's unique, right? The Montreal Olympics, they were building a unique stadium that had never been done before, and so modularity is basically the polar opposite of what I've just described. So, the best way to think about modularity is a solar farm. What is a solar farm? Well, you have a solar cell, and then you put a whole bunch of solar cells together equals one solar panel. A whole bunch of solar panels together equals, one row in the solar farm, and a whole bunch of rows equals a solar farm. All you're doing is repeating the same thing over and over again. Solar cell, solar panel, solar cell, solar panel, over and over and over and over and over again. Well, guess what? If you do the same thing over and over and over again, you're going to get really good at it. You're going to get very efficient. And solar farms, in fact, are one of the very few project types that does not have fat tail results.
Right.
They don't go wildly over budget and so on. In fact, out of all the project categories that Bent talks about, the solar farms, in fact, are top of the list. They are the best project type. And the reason why is because they are the most modular. So what you want to do is take that concept of modularity and see if you can apply it in other ways. Bent likes to call it, what's my Lego? If you think about Lego, right, that's the ultimate in modularity because it's just a whole bunch of different block types that are interchangeable and work with each other. And you just go click, 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 click. And you can just keep clicking as many as you want to build as big as you want. So you want to be able to take that concept and apply it somewhere else. Well, what's a nuclear power station? Traditionally, a nuclear power station is one enormous and incredibly complex structure. And typically they've been unique structures. You will design a new nuclear power plant and then you will build this nuclear power plant. And guess what? That's the opposite of modularity And the record for those projects is really, really bad.
Yeah.
Basically, they don't get better over time. They don't, so they blow their budgets. They come in way over schedule and so on. So what's happened in the nuclear power industry is a huge amount of money is now flowing into SMRs, which stands for small modular reactor. And it's right there in the name, right? It's small modular reactor. In other words, rather than having one gigantic power plant, you have a little one, like a Lego. And if you want more power out of it, you have another one that's identical, like another Lego. And if you want more power, you have another one and stack that on and so on. That's modularity. Now, that concept in the field of nuclear power is still to be proved. There's a lot of work and research going on, and the first prototypes are now under construction. But it's still we're still a long way from it. But that's the concept. And if you can take that concept, and as they're doing in nuclear power, take that concept in other fields. Ask yourself, what's my Lego? What's the one thing I repeat over and over again? And how do I maximize the use of it? That's how you can use modularity to increase the reliability of your project.
Yeah. You mentioned that solar farms are number one, right, as far as success for mega projects. What would be like the top couple of projects that are most likely to succeed based on past evidence?
Right. Oh, and very, very clear evidence on that. So it's solar power is number one, wind power is number two. And now people think that sounds like I'm being a tree hugger, right? This is, the two renewable power types are top of the charts. This has nothing to do with environmentalism or anything else. We're just looking at project data. How much does it cost? How long does it take? Does it deliver the benefits it's supposed to produce? And these two happen to be top of the charts. Now, the very fact that those two are top of the charts actually is incredibly telling because, as I said, solar power, that's obvious modularity.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Wind power, go and take a look. As big as a wind turbine is, it's actually a really simple device. There's a concrete base. There's a pole, right? You got your blades going around, and you got the body, the nacelle, where the turbine is, and that's really all it is, and some wiring to connect it. So it's actually, and then of course, if you want to expand that, you've got your one wind turbine, then you just do it again. Here's another wind turbine. If you want more, here's another wind turbine. And you can keep doing that for hundreds of wind turbines. Again, repeat.
Yeah.
So it's extremely modular.
Okay, what projects were at the bottom of the list? Like historically, they've done the worst.
Yep. Olympic Games, for the reasons we talked about.
Right.
Basically, giant. In fact, I can put a description on it. Anything that's giant, complex, and unique, that's typically at the bottom of the list. So Olympic Games, nuclear power plants, hydroelectric dams, these things just don't do well because they're basically, if you think about it, they're basically the opposite of modular. Now, I do want to put a little bit caveat on this. If you think about what Frank Gehry does, now I've been praising Frank Gehry. If you think about what Frank Gehry does, that kind of sounds actually like the second category, doesn't it? Right? Bilbao, Guggenheim. If you look at these giant buildings that Frank Gehry has built, they're enormous and they're completely unlike anything anybody has ever done before. So you would say, well, wait a second, isn't this one of the types of projects that's most likely to go wrong? And that's true. That's why it's so important to look at Frank Gehry's process, because that's exactly the type of thing that should go horribly wrong, but it doesn't. He routinely delivers on time and on budget. Why is he able to do that despite the fact that he's building unique buildings? The answer is in his simulation.
I'm really curious to know what you, as a journalist and someone who is, so very interested in psychology and decision making, what was the most important thing that you got out of this research, out of all this evidence?
The great psychologist Daniel Kahneman has this wonderful acronym, WYSIATI, WYSIATI. What you see is all there is. That's normal human decision making. When you look at a situation, you think, you assume that you have all the available facts that are relevant, and therefore you can proceed. What Frank Gehry is doing is saying, no, the opposite. when you start at the beginning and you look at a situation, assume that what you see is not all there is. Ask questions, learn more, then slowly develop an understanding. Well, what's the real goal? If you start every project, and frankly, you're right, it's not just projects, it's bigger than that. If you start your important decisions with that sort of open-minded, inquiring, exploratory mindset, you will improve your decision making. And if you don't, you're going to get in trouble.
Love this discussion, Dan. And yeah, as you say, this applies to so much more than mega projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, again, it's yeah, no, I mean, what's really important here is the human factor. It doesn't matter how many billions of dollars there is. It doesn't matter how much technology is involved.
Yeah.
It's ultimately people's decisions that determine the outcome.
Yeah. Really enjoyed speaking with you. All the best with your work.
Thank you so much.
That is Dan Gardner. He's a Canadian journalist and author of 4 books, including his most recent as co-author with Bent Flyvbjerg. It's called How Big Things Get Done. For more info on Dan and his work, you can check out our show notes. That's it for today's Cram podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And we would love your support. Please rate our podcast. You can also subscribe and follow us on social. Our handle is @CramIdeas. Thanks for listening and see you back here next time.